Hi, everybody. My name is Michael Hamauka, and I'm the CTO of the Immersive Learning Research Network. And I welcome you all today to the webinar. We're very happy to have Sarune with us today, and she's going to be presenting on blended XR curriculum approach, mix, multimodal immersive experience, lesson plan flowchart, and template development. And so without further ado, I will hand things over to Sarune.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for having me today. This is very much sort of a work in progress, so I'll do my best to explain sort of the background and how I came about this, but I'll signpost sort of where you can leave some feedback around this preprint, which is also available as a preprint. I'll signpost things. So my name is Sarune. It's spelled much differently. I'm not going to even say my last name. I'm from Lithuania, but I'm at the moment at University of Glasgow. So a little disclaimer, my office lights are motion sensor. So if they turn off, it's not like it's all of a sudden dark. I just have to wave my arm. So don't be alarmed. Nothing bad happened. It's quite dark in Scotland now because we're 5 p.m. So these slides are available. So it's under tinyurl.com in Ireland, November. So you can have these slides. I'm actually going to type that into the chat so you've got that. And because there's quite a few links and QR codes, so it's just something that is good to have accessible slides. Right, so I thought I'll just always start with this little short slide just to talk a little bit about my background, and then I'll talk a little bit about the work we've been doing in Glasgow as a backdrop for why I put this together. So I'm originally from Lithuania, and it's a bit of a strange name. I'm Sarune, Savickaite. I moved from Lithuania to London to study art and design initially. I wasn't in psychology to start with. However, I realized it wasn't perhaps my calling. I did my undergraduate in St Andrews, at the University of St Andrews, also in Scotland. That was the first time when I moved to Scotland in 2011. And then I absolutely loved psychology. I worked in perception and cognition mostly around stereo vision. And then I moved to Glasgow to pursue my PhD with Dr. David Simmons and Professor Neil MacDonald. It was a bit serendipitous. I initially thought I'll stay in vision science and work in stereo vision, but around that time, VR was just starting to emerge. It was around 2017, 2018. We're just starting to put together a proposal, and then it just really took off. So even throughout my PhD, I felt there was quite a lot of developments that I witnessed in VR. So I ended up almost become a little mini expert throughout the PhD, and particularly in such a changing field like XR. So I thought I'll start with my thesis. I graduated fairly recently. It's available online for you. The thesis was on the use of virtual reality to understand inner perceptual world of autism and actually some other associated neurodivergent conditions. So my work so far has very much been sort of two key pillars. There's XR on one side, which is very much your computer science, human-computer interactions based. And then I've got the neurodivergence on neurodiversity and accessibility work on the other. And it's quite sort of so far has complemented a lot of my work. And I've been part of iLearn Network as inclusivity and accessibility chair for a couple of years as well. But my PhD was also funded by industrial partners, Edify, and that's how I got into the immersive education and immersive learning. And I'll talk a little bit, I've got a little timeline of how all of the different ideas I have has developed and how I kind of came about talking about this lesson plan and flow chart, which I'll break down in a minute. Right, so where are we? Yes, I was going to talk you through. So there's quite several links here. So I'll try to break this slide down because that's just more or less the timeline of where we started with Glasgow and then where we are at the moment. So when I first started my PhD around the same time when there was still quite a lot of debates around what VR is, and I think it's still never ending. Around that time, we had Project Mobius, where my secondary supervisor, Professor Neil MacDonald, He had put together this proposal with Edify, where we created multi-user virtual reality labs. And Meta, so far recently, I think they don't mind us sharing, they were pretty impressed with this, and they think they're one of the best in the world for sure, especially for teaching. We have 15 headsets. And I think someone has a hand raised, so I don't know if I should take questions as I go, or should I, hopefully, maybe I'll wait until the end. So the teaching labs were, we started them in it's a large sort of essentially a room. You can see the little schematic here. I don't think I have any, now I'm thinking I didn't put any additional images on it, but there is a preprint available where I a little bit talk about the different sort of challenges we had with setting it up. And at the moment, it has 10 teaching apps and some sort of bespoke teaching apps that we are trying to use. It is still, we do have a bit of a challenge trying to get teachers to use it. I think majority of the classes we have are around medical sciences, biomedical sciences. That's sort of always a more straightforward topic where VR has certainly been used a little bit more extensively. But we're working on expanding and trying to create more lessons and getting people onboarded and converted perhaps to immersive education. I think for those who are here probably already interested in immersive education, you might be aware of how sometimes there is groups of people who are not fully convinced that VR or XR is good for teaching or where it's useful. And there's a lot of people who think it's great, and we're on the cusp of something really exciting. So I think I'm in the latter group. Then we were put together our strategy board, which then led into creation of ArcXR space. So for those who have been in Island conference last year in Glasgow, hopefully had sort of had a chance to look at our facilities in the Advanced Research Center. There's a link here of what we're doing. On the operational board for the space, and this is mostly research sort of facilities we have where the lights. I don't think it's too dark. Where the Partick Borough Hall teaching labs are centered around teaching. So throughout my PhD, I worked in Edify, where I worked with several educators trying to put lessons together using Edify. Edify is now merged with another company. It's not really trading on its own, but a lot of the apps are still within the University of Glasgow, and we intend to do a lot more work around those. And most recently, well, perhaps not so recently now, last year we had Meta sponsored our immersive education policy paper, which again is I linked here, and I led an accessibility work package there. And now I'm working on trying to put together a special interest group to encourage people in our university to explore immersive education, because like I said, some people are very much on board and love teaching in our teaching labs, but then some people are still not fully convinced that how we can use them. And Meta certainly has recently announced that they're collaborating with the University of Glasgow and some other universities in the UK and then the US, trying to put together some efficacy work around use of VR for teaching. So I think there's lots of exciting times ahead. So this is a little bit of the background of where a lot of my thinking is. I realize I'm actually talking quite quickly, so I'll maybe try to pace myself a little bit. So this was our white paper. We have a white paper and the report. It was led by Neil MacDonald. We had two colleagues from education, Lavinia and Gabriella. We had our strategy lead, Imans, and then myself and Lizette, who is a visually impaired colleague who works with XR and disability theory on how we work with assistive technologies. So we were responsible for accessibility package, and accessibility part in the white paper and the report was fairly small. So we've done quite a lot more work than you'll find in the paper and the report. And that's something that we want to put a separate paper on that at some point, maybe next year, to communicate a lot of the different ideas that we had. The main considerations that we thought were at the forefront moving forward in terms of accessibility is something that we put in these white papers. But there's still a huge amount of work that needs to be done on accessibility, whether it's considering physical accessibility, sensory differences, or neurodiversity, which is sort of more of my expertise. Right, this is just something, a little bit of a little plug for my work course, but I like sort of teaching with VR, but we've just recently established virtual reality in psychology research course. And only this year, I've started putting a textbook together because I realized for a lot of students, when they want to learn just very quick basic information about how they can apply VR or XR technology in psychology research or any sort of educational adjacent type of research, they struggle to get started because there's so much sort of background knowledge that is available, but it's not really condensed. So stay tuned. I'm going to put this book into an open source format, and we've got several of open source books within our department, so that's going to be coming along. But this also has got me thinking in terms of talking about and teaching virtual reality and then teaching with virtual reality, and there's lots of different considerations around that. So this is all, again, preamble before I start talking about my idea for the lesson plan. So I think throughout my PhD, and this is from my thesis actually, the Gartner cycle, which I presume most people are familiar with, but I'll talk you through it. So any new technology, and I think we've seen this in XR in particular, always has sort of the inception. So it's some sort of a trigger, and then there is a peak of inflated expectations, and then it follows a very similar path, all different technologies. Then it drops very quickly into the disillusionment, then somewhat slightly increases the slope of enlightenment, and then eventually plateaus. I'm still debating where we are with XR, but we certainly, I don't think necessarily at the peak anymore. I think that certainly peaked a couple of years ago. People could still argue maybe that we're still there, but I think we're starting to go through the disillusionment, at least at trying to, in terms of immersive education, I certainly sometimes feel like we are through at the disillusionment phase, because we have, or at this point, where there's quite a bit of evidence. It's patchy at different, it might need to be systemized a little bit more, but we already know that it's an exciting medium to teach with, teach about, think about, explore, but it's perhaps sort of, there's a little bit of a dip in terms of there's a group of people who are certainly on board and wants to explore the technology, and there is certain groups that perhaps still needs a little bit more convincing. So I think this is the time when there's just a lot of evidence being built, and I see through LinkedIn and lots of different exciting papers coming out in the space. So certainly it needs a little bit more work, but we're certainly on the right track, which is, I was hoping the peak of inflated expectations would stay longer, but I think we're starting to make up for it with a lot of work that's going into it. So most recently, when I was teaching, we were talking about virtual reality in our class. I realized I needed to explain to our students, but then also I find having these conversations over and over again with a lot of people within our department or people within XR space even, and just sort of having the differences between propositions of what we're talking about. So when we talk about XR, a lot of the time people always assume that we're talking about research to start with, but then we need to be very clear when we talk about research, whether it's research on XR and how XR functions, or whether we're using XR to do research. So it is mostly, again, I think I've done a little bit of both, and well, perhaps less of the research on XR and how it functions, but as part of my PhD, I would certainly use VR as a tool to do research, and I explored neurodiversity with it. But through that, you sort of inadvertently influence research on XR and how that develops. But there needs to be the certain distinction, clarity. And I think the discussion of definitions and what is meant by XR or VR has been debatable, but I think it has multiple layers where clarity and definitions need to be clearer. Then the same applies to teaching. So we've got teaching about extended reality. So we've got for example, my course where I talk about virtual reality, and a lot of people want to learn about it, and it's certainly a very popular course. But then we have teaching with XR, where we have multi-user labs, such as the one in Partick Borough Hall in Glasgow. And this is, again, where I talk about academics, perhaps, who are not been in the immersive education space. They often get that confused, whether we're teaching with VR and how that's possible, and then teaching about XR. And then sort of where that crosses over, if it crosses over, and then what else? And then trying to understand the sort of experiential and active learning that's involved with teaching with extended reality. And then you could I put this in italics because you can sort of really think from teaching versus learning from learner's perspective and then the teacher's perspective. So there's something that I'm nearly finished with a preprint around teachers' cognitive load. I think in immersive education, whereas cognitive load is not the best term, but probably the best we have at the moment. Certainly the effort from the teacher side increases significantly than from sort of other standardized lessons, where for the learner perhaps is a little bit more exciting, engaging. So you could argue it reduces some of that cognitive load or makes learning a lot more enjoyable for the teacher. That increases the preparation and considerations. And that's where I will transition into talking about the lesson plan and how I came about that. So these are just as non-exhaustive link. These are some of the images from the different lesson proposals that I put together throughout. These are all using Edify. There's some top view classroom environment view. There's, again, as someone in psychology, neuroanatomy seems to be a straightforward example, and some sort of general setups. But there's still a lot of efficacy questions that linger. There's a lot of work around this, but it's still not systemized or summarized enough. So classroom management, deployment and costs, these two have particularly recently, I've discussed this extensively with some of the colleagues, particularly in deployment and costs. I do not think it's necessarily such a barrier that most people think it is, but it's one of the most common questions that I certainly get asked. Accessibility and cognitive load, as someone as a psychologist, I'm certainly particularly interested in. I think there's still a lot of considerations and awareness that needs to happen in that space. Content availability is something that is certainly a huge barrier for teachers to overcome that. Teachers need to become almost experts, and then I talk about digital literacy there as well. The teachers need to learn to develop and work within virtual environments if they don't know that already, and that's a huge barrier for some of the teachers. And we've noticed that a lot in Edify, where we have quite a simplistic setup where you could import a lot of different assets into already existing environments, but lecturers still struggle to overcome the sort of initial barrier of how to use the space, how to navigate it, and really utilize it. And again, that's something I'll talk a little bit about in the preprint. But there's a lot of sort of the virtual reality space was often underutilized in a lot of lesson plans that were proposed by lecturers that were trying to put a lesson together. They were approaching the lesson as they would in the real life. They were putting whiteboards in VR or making it very static and two-dimensional in VR, which sort of defeats the purpose of actually using it VR. So it needs to be a certain sort of shift on how you utilize the space. And that's not necessarily intuitive for people who are not necessarily in this area or of research. And then you've got engagement and active learning. Active learning has sort of been a catch-all term that's very popular these days. I personally think that active learning is every learning. I prefer creative teaching as an alternative to that. But it's certainly one of those catchy terms that it's been increasingly popular these days. So I think this is sort of enough preamble in the background, but I'm happy to answer some questions if it's not really clear. But I think that gives you a bit of an overview where my perspective is. And as someone who perhaps, as a psychologist, I feel like I sometimes spend too much time trying to organize this quite chaotic field in a sense, particularly because working in XR and in neurodiversity, both of these areas are changing very rapidly, and trying to stay on top of these both, it can be quite challenging. So I had thought about the lesson template for a long time after working in Edify and seeing the struggles that a lot of teachers face when they first encounter virtual reality, or even talking with our neuroscientist in the department. They're very keen to use virtual reality, they're excited about the labs, but they get stuck on where do I even start? I'm not an expert in this, what do I do? So this is, again, very much work in progress. You can have a look at the preprint. It's just the first iteration. I'm more than happy to take suggestions, but this is an attempt in sort of almost saying things that are sort of obvious, but putting them on paper. And I think we're missing out in a lot of things in immersive education space, needs that be stated more explicitly, because we, I think, sometimes get a bit lost in, we have a lot of knowledge in the space, and we forget that not everyone has the same level of knowledge, and they need some sort of a starting point. And this is an attempt to somewhat take some of the expertise and some of the struggles I witnessed in other teachers, and trying to put that into some sort of a coherent paper, if you like, to communicate that. And I appreciate it's quite a tricky concept. Well, maybe not so much, but yeah, any feedback is welcome. So I'll try my best to talk through it. So this is a flow chart I've got at the moment. And again, it seems pretty straightforward, and something that I'm pretty sure whoever worked with XR and immersive education have thought about. But again, it's almost stating things that we all know about or we talked about, but never really had explicitly written somewhere. And this is, again, an example of this. So this is something that, again, I intended to, for someone who maybe doesn't have much XR experience, where do you even start? So you have a traditional lesson plan, you've got your aims, your objectives, what do you want the students to achieve? And it doesn't mean that XR is going to completely replace this, but it needs to be careful consideration why XR is used, and what does it add? Does it help students achieve the intended learning outcomes better or quicker? Or is it just, for lack of a better word, a gimmick that you're trying just to give students to try VR? It's not necessarily wrong. I think novelty effect has its use in some cases if you want to get students a bit of a break. But if you are using that for a pedagogical work, or trying to consider how it can be integrated in the lesson plans and curriculum, it needs to be a little bit more considerate of why we're using extended reality. So when you're making a decision, you can think of, okay, what elements are we keeping there from traditional? So you will have slides, you'll have worksheets, you'll have video content, and a lot of that can be transported into virtual reality, but it can be left outside of virtual reality. So once again, in Edify, we used to have ability to embed slides and videos, but then the question is why we want them in VR. We know that there are certain issues with spending too much time in VR. Some people get cyber sickness. That needs to be carefully considered. Then we've got elements of the lesson that can utilize XR technology. So how can we break it down, what needs to be in XR and what doesn't need to be in XR? And then elements that can be discarded due to adoption of XR technology. So maybe perhaps some videos we no longer need to use because we have three-dimensional models instead. So again, it's just really taking someone who's thinking of using XR and then breaking it down, whether it's worthwhile exploring, or perhaps there's certain topics that XR is perhaps not going to be necessarily the greatest tool for, and that's fine, but just being starting to think from it at the very beginning. And then think about how all of these different modes of teaching will integrate, and whether you will have a session before the XR element, prepare students for it, bring them into the lab, and get them to try VR. Is it going to be a multi-user setup, or students can explore this individually? Again, all of those different considerations. But then there is a separate adjacent thing that we have at the same time. All these considerations are being sort of thought about. you've got the teacher's individual journey. So how much the teacher understands virtual reality, and do they have someone to help them if they do not? What assets are they available? Can they create them, or do they know how to find them? And how to align everything to existing pedagogical approaches. Again, it's great to use virtual reality, but we still need to consider how that fits into the curriculum and why. And then the idea is that we can put all these considerations at the simplest of tables if need be, but it's kind of broken down that these considerations need to be listed and teachers need to think about them as they go through it. And then again, this is where the teacher's job is much more harder, because you do need to think about things that students will experience. So onboarding is one of the challenges that students always have. Even with the new technology now, it's very straightforward. Even if you've got app prepared, you just put the headset on and play around with it. But we've done some work on onboarding before with students, and what we found is that there's general anxiety with the use of the new technology. There's still the perception that VR is somehow really expensive, that they will break it. They're not necessarily going to be pressing different buttons and exploring the environment. So it's something we need to continuously remind students of. The controller is they're always an issue. No matter how many times we show the participants which button to press, and no matter how simplistic you make it, they'll still get lost. Luckily, now we have a bit more of the hand tracking technology, so hopefully that's going to move away from the challenge with the controllers. Cognitive load is something, again, it's a huge area that still, I think, has a lot of potential in immersive education. And there's a lot of psychology. We have an assumption that when we enter virtual reality and extended reality, that it's going to be exactly the same as the real world. And we know that that's not the case. There's a lot of perceptual differences and cognitive differences that we need to think about. And yes, of course, we've got the novelty effect that everyone thinks about, and engagement. So if you utilize that well, I think that can work to our advantage, but it's just something to be aware of. And then always we need to consider whether the activity is linked to assessment somehow, or is it something that is just nice to have. So again, a very wordy, but hopefully the flowchart starts to make sense. So I've got a few other steps that I've tried to break it down. Again, it's not exhaustive, so more than willing to take suggestions. So this is, I've broken down the teacher's journey to try to make it as simple as possible. So you've got, initially you might have a skills assessment where you think of the XR knowledge, what's available, what software and hardware are available. And then you plan the XR lesson through the sort of flow chart that I talked about. Think about the design, testing, and the implementation, but also at the same time thinking of adapting the existing lesson plan that as teachers might have. Think of XR considerations and how to utilize XR space, and then try to maybe put a storyboard together. Again, everyone works differently or how they would approach XR, so this is not the one size fits all, but it's just some considerations that might resonate with some of these teachers. And this is one of the images that I tried my best to portray what I mean, but one of the challenges where I've already mentioned is that someone who's not necessarily used to using immersive technology, and even sometimes I forget and I use XR daily, how to utilize the space that's available. And we spend all our time in relying on very much two-dimensional and tools. So entering VR and thinking that, okay, we can change physics here, we can manipulate this environment, it doesn't naturally occur to us. So we just have this enormous space. But again, like I said, this is my attempt to illustrate where a lot of teachers approach the lesson is placing some sort of two-dimensional content and 3D models and leaving it at that. But we also know that you can have almost 360-degree videos that can be embedded as environments or have some sort of maybe fancy environments that they created themselves. Again, this is my attempt to represent that. But then this was, I suppose, the wackiest way I can think of representing that you can really manipulate any object to any scale you want and really sort of change the laws of physics in VR. And that's something that doesn't necessarily come natural to us when we first encounter the technology. And again, that's a psychologist in me thinking, we already have so much information to process when we first start using the technology that all of these exciting possibilities do not normally occur to us. So it's just allowing ourselves space to really sit down and think through what we can achieve in VR and then going and experimenting, because we sometimes can forget that because of the sheer volume of information that we have. So again, this is another visual. I'm quite a visual thinker, so there's a lot of visual representations. This is another way to perhaps approach lesson plans. So this was that helped some of the teachers we worked with identify, so listing different assets they have. So perhaps there's animation, some sort of an environment, 3D content, some of the traditional learning materials, and then really allowing them to almost think of the positions of where the teachers might be, maybe where the individual elements are placed, and sort of thinking about it in three-dimensional space. In this case, I'm keeping reusing this classroom environment, but if there is in this instance, we had all the environments from the top view and they had this sort of map-like structure that we found that it was useful for teachers to think about their lesson in this sort of almost map-like way. Others preferred the storyboard where they had a specific ideas of how they wanted the lesson to flow. But again, it's something that we need to sit down and plan out. Yes, of course, there's going to be a level of experimentation we'll need to do and extend in VR or XR. But then for all of that to come together, we'll need to sit down and really plan it as to make sure it makes sense to the student. So this is, again, I'll try to take through the table. It should be pretty straightforward, but this is essentially just a tool to work through and think of, like, what am I missing? What do I need to consider? And really just a simple table at the moment, but it has, I hope, a lot of scope for us to work on. And I'm more than happy to talk about potentials we can talk about. So again, it's really taking things to like a basic level, thinking, okay, what's the subject, what's the topic? We can, again, miss some of those, but really breaking things down. What is the technology used? What do we have available? Do we have everything that we need? And what are traditional tools that are adjacent? And always going back to learning objectives, all intended learning outcomes, and the ones that we can cover in this lesson and which ones we don't have a capacity to do that. And then thinking of what is available and what we would need to maybe upskill or find additional help with. And I think there's a bit of repetition here. And there's any maybe supplementary materials. This is where it's important to consider if there is any support required alongside the teacher being with the student or students in the space. What if something happens with a headset and student doesn't know what to do? All of these different considerations, you almost need to be a teacher, a tech support, a GTA, and everything else that might essentially go wrong with the lesson. So this is one way to think about it, of how to integrate the lesson. So you might have an introduction and it's some sort of alignment of traditional learning versus XR experiences, and then reflection and comparison. And that can be sort of mix and matched as you wish. Mostly because in XR, we don't want novice users necessarily spending an enormous amounts of time in XR. So it's good to break these down and help people experience sort of traditional modes alongside XR. There's a lot of different suggestions that I happen to find in literature of different stations. Maybe you want to have a video alongside XR. But again, it requires some careful thinking of how you will ensure that it's a smooth transition for the learners to go through all switching these different modes and how they benefit from them. And this is the Student engagement and accessibility considerations. And again, this is where I would like to spend a little bit more time in the future developing this further, because I think all of these different considerations could almost branch out to a lot more work that needs to go into this. So cognitive load management. How do we limit the VR time and avoid overload and incorporate breaks and opportunities for reflection? It's fantastic to have the students engage and absolutely love XR. Students love doing anything in XR, at least I found. But you need to still break it down and make sure that they think about what they're learning or utilize the space as much as we can. Student discomfort. So no matter how much students enjoy the XR technology. Even last week, we had a lab for our VR module course on VR for psychology research. We had students just try different apps in VR just to explore how it works. And no matter how much they loved it, there were certain apps that were starting to feel queasy. So you need to make sure you always monitor that and that make sure students have something else to do if they are feeling motion sickness or the cyber sickness. Behavioral considerations. There needs to have some sort of clear guidelines for students and consider potential distractions, because they can get very quickly distracted. And if you are thinking of neurodiversity and accessibility, you need to consider that someone who has ADHD or autistic traits, they might not necessarily respond to the lesson setup as you initially set up for yourself. So there's a scope for consultation and other accessibility and considerations, but it's a little bit of a side note. I'll leave it for now. And that's where leads to the next point, which is inclusivity. So thinking of alternative tasks, because not everyone necessarily is going to enjoy XR. I've never experienced people who do not, but it is certainly a possibility. And then post-lesson reflection. So really encourages teachers, yeah, it's great to roll out these classes and it's really exciting, but then how can you continuously improve? And it's still very much a changing area. So how is the technology effective? Was XR technology effective in achieving the lesson objectives, or were students distracted, or did actually engage more? Logistical challenges. So were there any equipment malfunctions? Did time management the time you planned for the lesson actually ended up being the same lesson plan? Or because of the different challenges, you need to allocate a lot more time, or you need additional support, such as graduate teaching assistants? And then cognitive load on the teacher. So think of what's the sort of stress of managing this new technology and how it can be impacting the pedagogy. Because we've got, yes, technology is exciting, but then we still need to think of what we're doing here as teachers and how we're embedding this in the curriculum. And then thinking of a student response. Again, students are likely to engage with it, but maybe they felt some discomfort. We need to know about that and then implement changes if needed. So what I was going to say. So at the moment, I've actually working with neuroscientists trying to put a basic lesson together using this sort of thought process. Our neuroscientists do not have any VR experience whatsoever. We had several different companies. We had ClearPixel recently come and talk to us. They had these already set up lessons, which are great for wet labs. But again, it's not necessary works for all of the neuroscientists that we have. So I remembered, this is at the moment just a little video of the different assets we have, but I remembered we had this spinal cord 3D model that could be useful for our neuroscientists. So what they've done is looked at all of my videos, like such as these, demonstrating what we have available. And then they put their lesson plan together using the template I provided, the one that's in the preprint, which helped them really to think about the things that they can plan. So they've not experienced VR and they don't have expertise, but what they can do is plan what the lesson, what is the lesson they want to deliver. So they have, at the moment, I think we'll try to implement it in next semester, semester 1. We didn't have a chance to do it this semester. And we've got some scans of from the three-dimensional microscope, so we'll try to incorporate those. And then it will be myself who would consider the XR technology and cognitive load aspects. So it's really sort of a very much a collaborative effort so far, but hopefully it will be a more sort of worked example of how we can implement these different considerations and work through the template available. So I really hope that made sense. But there is this link is available in the preprint where I'm trying to collate everyone who's got any feedback or suggestions of what else I might have missed out, because there's a chance I have, or anything else that we would need to expand on, or any particular way maybe some ideas can need to be condensed or clarified. So I would very much appreciate any input or feedback that you might have around this. But again, a reminder that the slides are available online with tiny URL link Island November. But I think I don't know if anyone's got any questions, but I hope it made sense. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarune. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. So I would like to open the floor up for questions. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to post in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll wait a few minutes for people to be able to type things in. Yeah. While we're waiting for questions to come in, is there anything else you'd like to say? I mean, do you have an area where people can follow your work or to get
Yes, so
updates? And
there's LinkedIn. So I linked my website. So my website has my social media LinkedIn in there if you want it. But you can take it from there. I think I think I had a question on onboarding.
yes, yeah.
Yeah, so onboarding, we've done a very short study on that a couple of years ago, actually. And it was very short, and I would love to expand a little bit more. It was actually done not with students. We just had a very simple lesson on Gutenberg Press created by Edify. It was a very short 10-minute lesson. And it worked great because we could really just recruit anyone who wanted to learn a little bit about the Gutenberg Press. So I think we had about 20 participants, no extensive pool. But this is the sort of challenges we noticed, and these are the themes that emerge, where general anxiety just doing anything in VR, because they first come in, they see the headsets, it looks all fancy, there's a lot of computers in the room. We did this in our multi-user lab, and it's just immediate anxiety, like, oh, what if I'll break it? What if something happens? And we just needed to always say, don't worry, there's nothing you can do that will break it. Just play around with it, enjoy it. But there is just initial sort of hurdle that it just needs additional encouragement from the teachers. So the larger the class, the more challenging it is to manage it. So we luckily did it as smaller groups, but I imagine with even 5+, it would be a challenge for the teacher to really make sure everyone's comfortable with everything. So it does require that consideration. Controllers was another big barrier. And I've showed them slides of what the controllers look like. I showed them what the controllers look like. I told them, press the trigger. As soon as people get into VR, they press everything. And then they say it doesn't work. And it happens every single time. Again, like I think gamers tend to pick up quicker of what to press and what to do, because I think that's just the general most common knowledge that they tend to pick this up. But that was a very common problem. And then it takes, again, time for the teacher or with the GTA to almost come to everyone and see. But the one positive thing, this wasn't just the challenges with onboarding. What we found that when the students eventually were in VR, they were communicating with each other perhaps more than they would otherwise. So they couldn't see each other. They were all working on their individual lessons, but they really just shared their experiences, like, oh my God, this is so cool. Did you see that? And they almost just spoke to each other much more. And we've noticed that in studies where we used autistic individuals to do drawing experiments, it wasn't teaching related. But I've noticed that people like to really talk in VR. And I think it's because the power and balance between experiment and the teacher and the participant or the learner is reduced because they can't see you. So that social element it reduces. And they like to talk a lot more. So they're more likely to expand on their experiences. So I think these are probably the key takeaways from the really short work, sort of piece of work we did, but I think it's much more we can do with it.
That's awesome. Um, we have another question here asking, did you work with teachers in middle and high schools?
No, we are all in higher education at the moment, but I think there is certainly a lot of scope to explore that. I think my feeling is that Meta wants to probably explore a little bit more of how that can be rolled into education a little bit more broadly. But my expertise is mostly in higher education, mostly because that's where I teach. So I don't think I would imagine that my pedagogical knowledge wouldn't be not nearly enough to explore the schools where I think would definitely need a lot more considerations and work in that area.
Great. So Alicia says, I did it with 20 students. So we changed to work from home. We used a multiplayer environment. And she says, I would love to exchange about experiences.
Yeah, that would be another interesting idea to explore because we had talked about again when I talked about in the slide when I said teaching with VR and teaching about VR are two separate things. So almost multi-user almost has different ideas as well because in our multi-user lab, all the individuals there in the same physical space, but they're normally in separate virtual spaces. But you can flip that and have people in separate physical spaces, but the same virtual space. And again, that sort of very simplistic separation of the terminology can be sometimes missed in literature, I think. Maybe it's just me that trying to be very organized, but I think we need some sort of clarity in definitions and how what we're talking about, that being very, very clear of what we're saying, because it can be missed in translation sometimes. I think for those who work in the area is much more straightforward because we know it inside out. But for someone who's just starting off, it becomes very confusing very quickly because it's just so much terminology that it's just a lot. So yeah. I see there's a Q&A, but
Oh,
is the
yeah.
press the demo lesson available? It's not available to download yet, but I'm not sure what will happen with it in the future. But at the moment, it's just available. If you come to University of Glasgow, you can try it, but it's not available elsewhere.
I see.
But maybe it will be in the future. I'm not sure. It's not up to me.
Okay. Yeah.
But it would be exciting to see that because it's a really good lesson.
Yeah, it sounds fascinating. I'd love to see it as well.
It was part of the Project Mobius, so I think maybe just some IP associated with it. I don't know. Maybe with time it'll become a more available, but yeah, I'm hoping they will.
Hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So, Sarune, again, thank you very much for your presentation. This is really excellent. I really enjoyed it, and from all the great comments in the Q or in the chat, it sounds like everybody else really enjoyed it as well. So, thank you very
Oh,
much. For everybody who's watching, if you want to rewatch the presentation or if you'd like to forward it on to other people, the recording will be available probably in a couple of days on our YouTube channel. That's the Immersive Learning Research Network YouTube channel, and I'll just post the link here. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming, and I hope everybody has a great day, a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. And we'll see you in the next one. Okay,
thanks
thanks
so
very
much.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.